Hi, my name is Joe Novani and I'm going to be discussing today information processing theory as researched by Atkinson and Shiffrin in 1968. To start us off, I'm going to ask you a question. What do you know about how the mind processes memories? So take a moment and try to think, what do you know about how you remember something, an event, information? How is it that your mind encodes that information? When we talk about memory, there are three types of memory. The first type is called your sensory memory, or SM. The second type is called short-term memory, or STM. And the third type is called LTM, or long-term memory. The schematic here shows how the memories are processed in the order in which they're processed, according to Atkinson and Shiffrin. First, you have to have some sort of external stimuli from the environment that is then processed as a sensory memory. Then with a little more process, it becomes a short-term memory, and through more process, that short-term memory becomes a long-term memory. When we talk about a sensory memory, it's important to know that this is energy being transformed into different types of energy, and in the process that creates a memory. So let's take, for instance, the information that's being given to the person is light. The light is energy. That energy then is going to be converted in your mind to different types of energy, and in the process of creating a different type of energy, or converting it into a different type of energy, a memory is made from there. This can also be done with sound. This can be done with smell or even touch, so heat or cold. But any one of those, they can be processed and turned into a sensory memory. In the process of the transduction, so from one energy to another, a memory is created, and this usually takes about half a second for something that you might see, and about 3 seconds for something that you might hear. That's the process in which it will create a sensory memory. This is important to know because once you give a little more process to that sensory memory, we then go into the next type of memory, which is your short-term memory, the STM. There are basically two types of ways in which we get a short-term memory. Once attention is given to the sensory memory, we then see that we have the short-term memory, the STM, is created. This lasts about 15 to 20 seconds. Now, if we give that short-term memory more process, so we maybe think about it or rehearse it in a way, we now go into the long-term memory. But we're first going to talk about the short-term memory and how that works. The short-term memory occurs in the frontal lobe, called the prefrontal lobe of the brain. And this is where we give attention to that sensory memory and create the short-term memory. So with this short-term memory, there's two major concepts of information retention. The two things that have to happen are organization and repetition. With organization in your short-term memory, there are actually 4 types of things that will occur in order for your brain to be able to process that short-term memory. The first is component, and this is where we kind of talk about part and whole of something, or classification by a category that you might have previously known. Then we talk about your sequential. This is kind of the chronological order of things. Cause and effect is a very important part of this component. Then after that we have your relevance. The relevance is kind of taking a central unifying idea or criteria and creating that short-term memory. And then finally we have the transitional. The transitional, this is kind of a connective phase of the short-term memory. And some of you who have done the research on Piaget and Erikson's stages of socio-emotional development will know a little bit more about the transitional component of organization. Another important component of short-term memory that we use a lot of times in the classroom is chunking, the chunking of information. This is taking pieces of data and breaking them into units. There's an example that's used with the letters B, D, and E, right? B, D, and E each have their own bit of information. 3 separate units with each of them having their own information. But when put together, we have bed, B-E-D. That's 1 unit of information in which we process it. So that's chunking of information, or an example of chunking of information. Then we move on from the short-term memory to our question. And the question is, how many components are there to organization of the short-term memory? And what are they? Are you able to name those components of organization for short-term memory? The next phase that we look into is the long-term memory. So after we've taken the short-term memory, we now give it more process, rehearsal, in what is what we would call that. And when we rehearse it, we then encode it into our long-term memory. The long-term memory information is relatively easily recalled. This isn't something that takes a long time for us to remember. The 2 things that move this into our long-term memory are the elaboration and distributed practice. So when we talk about elaboration, we're talking about imaging. When we say imaging, we're saying, what does this make you think of? Create a mental picture about this memory or bit of information that we're trying to get you to encode. The next is your method of loci, which is your locations. Ideas are things that are to be remembered or connected to objects, locations that are familiar to the subject. The next one is pegword. Pegword, which is an odd word. And this is actually using number or rhyming schemes. Ideas or things to be remembered are connected to specific words. 1 bun, 2 shoe, 3 tree, that sort of thing. Finally, we have rhyming. Rhyming is next. This is a song or a phrase, so the information is to be arranged in a rhyme. 30 days has September, April, June, and November. All the rest are 31. Okay, so that would be a rhyming scheme that to help you remember what the information is. And finally, initial letter. This is the first letter of each word in a list that's used. So you can make an acronym out of it. These are the types of things that you could use to encode something into your longer term memory. So the reason that these processes are important is because this is what we use in the classroom. When we talk about gaining the student's attention, the first thing that we do, we might use cues or a signal word to get them to come to attention and to let them know they're ready to begin the lesson. We might move around the room, and moving around the room and using different inflections in our voice, we draw the listener's attention to what we are saying, the information we're giving them. This is all part of our sensory memory, right? These are things that we do as teachers to get the student ready to receive the new information. And then we're going to bring to mind relevant prior learning. So we ask the student to remember something, to go back and try to connect the new piece of information that we're going to give them. So we might do this by reviewing the previous day's lesson. This is especially helpful in math, say, where you're trying to teach a new concept and connect it to the concept that was learned previously, the day before. The next one we want to do is point out the important information. So we want to do this by providing handouts to the students to draw their attention to what is needed, what they're needed to know. This kind of gives you that repetition to help encode that sensory memory into the short-term memory. Present the information in an organized manner. Remember, we talked about the organization being an important component of the short-term memory. So we might want to show a logical sequence to concepts and to the skills. Go from the simple to the complex, right? So we're putting it in order for the student to understand when presenting the new material. Now we want to show students how to categorize or chunk the related information. So we present this information in categories. When we present them in categories, the students are able to remember the categories, and then they can remember the things that go into those categories. And then we also want to help to teach inductive reasoning. We want the students to be able to take the information and then start to channel it into the things that they know, the categories that they know, so that they can recall this information easier. Next, we want to talk about providing opportunities for students to elaborate on new information. So when we connect new information to something they already know, right, we make that previous, the previous knowledge that they have, we want to take that and connect it to the new information that they are going to learn. Look for similarities and differences in the new information. This might be done actually in a FRAIR model, where you can talk about what is the definition of a word, what is a non-definition of a word, what is a non-example of that word, so that they can make that connection. Next, we talk about showing students how to use coding when memorizing lists. So we'll make up silly things for them to remember. Please excuse my dear Aunt Sally, PEMDAS, when we're talking about the order of operations in math. When we're talking about the planets and their distance from the sun, we edit. Or use the mnemonic device when you're discussing the planets. My very elegant mother just served us 9 pickles, right? You're talking about the planets and their distance from the sun closest to the furthest. Now, we want to provide for repetition of learning. So here we want to state the important principles several times in different ways during the presentation for the information. This is going to be for the short-term memory. Then when we start talking about the long-term memory, we want to have items on each day's lesson from the previous lesson so that they can start building upon the short-term memory and continue on making those connections so that it starts to encode in their long-term memory. And we also want to talk about scheduling periodic reviews of previously learned concepts, checking in, doing an informal assessment to see where the students are in the information that you're teaching them. And finally, we want to provide opportunities for overlearning of fundamental information. So use daily drills for arithmetic facts, or we want to be able to play form of Trivial Pursuit with the content that's related to the class, or Jeopardy, to be able to get the students to make those connections and show that they know that information. So these were the 3 ways in which information is processed through the processing theory that Atkinson and Shiffrin had first discovered or researched in 1968. Again, it is the sensory memory, the short-term memory, and the long-term memory that are used to encode information and to remember it or be able to recall it for later use. Thank you.